Ana Santos, a freelance journalist based in the Philippines, was our 2014 Persephone Miel Fellow, and that's an annual competition for us, unlike the rolling grants that Tomas was talking about, inspired by our late friend Persephone Miel, that goes to a non-US journalist who we believe has the potential to reach an international audience. Ana is our poster child for the success of that idea. A prodigiously talented reporter and writer who's done multiple projects with us on topics ranging from the experience of Filipino nannies to reproductive rights, religion, and divorce. If you look on our site, you'll find more than 50 stories by Ana out of those projects for outlets that range from NPR and the Washington Post to The Atlantic, Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, and more. She has spoken for us at international conferences in Copenhagen and Bali and at schools and universities across the United States. So, Ana.
Okay, I have to pull this down. Prince Charles and Anthony Bourdain may not know it, but they have one very important thing in common. Their children have been loved and raised in part by a Filipino nanny. Lily Picho, who is now retired and still single, was one of 3 nannies who took care of Prince Harry and Prince William. The royal nanny, as they called her, was the only Filipino invited to Kate and William's wedding. When she was interviewed by the Philippine journalists in Europe, they had one pressing question for her. What are you going to wear? Anthony Bourdain fashioned one episode of his show as an open love letter to the Philippines, prompted by his family's close relationship with their Filipino baby nurse, Vanji. Good evening. I'm Ana P. Santos. I'm a Filipino journalist and Pulitzer Center grantee, like many of you here. As a Pulitzer Center's Persephone Miel Fellow, I spent most of 2014 telling the story of Filipino migrant women like Miss Lily and Miss Vanji, women who spend their lives caring for others while separated from those they love. Later, I told their story in dozens of classroom sessions on a Pulitzer Center tour. The Miel Fellowship was one of the first, it was first of 3, Pulitzer Center grants in 3 years. But before I go into that, I think I should tell you a little bit about myself. And this is the point in the speech that we often call the disclaimer. Though I graduated with a journalism degree, I wasn't always a journalist, mostly because I feared my mother's prophecy that journalism was not going to be a financially viable career. I was a banker for about 9 years and left my position as assistant vice president to become a journalist writing about HIV and sexual health rights in 2009. Who does that? My mother was thoroughly appalled. Well, when you see how many babies are born in my country, 4 every minute by the last UN count, you'll know that we need more people like me who spend more time talking and writing about sex rather than having it. Sad for me. When I applied for the Migrant Mothers Grant, Tom Hundley suggested I make a documentary. And he asked me, "You've made documentaries before, right?" I answered, "Well, I'm gonna make one now." That started a year-long project where I followed the migration path of Filipino migrant mothers. I started in the Philippines, interviewing families left behind before meeting these migrant mothers in Paris and in Dubai. Whenever I could, I would bring pictures of their children to them. In Paris, I surprised Miss Gemma with pictures of her son Vlad, whom she had not seen in about 4 years. She engulfed me in a tight embrace, and I laughed, taken aback by the display of affection to a total stranger. Then I felt my heart break a little when she pulled back and with an expectant look asked me, "How tall is my son now, Ana?" I was no stranger. I was the person who had last seen Gemma's husband and son. Last May, I was in Denmark with Alison Shelley, who is here this evening, reporting on mostly young Filipino women who are supposed to be au pairs on a cultural exchange, but mostly function as domestic workers. Grants from the Pulitzer Center give us the gift of time to seek out and tell the untold stories, giving voice to the forgotten and the overlooked, like migrant mothers in the Middle East and young Filipino au pairs in Europe. Always, the time I spent with these women, these migrant mothers, and these au pairs left me with a heavy heart. You have to understand, I'm also Filipino. We have the same hopes and aspirations. We have the same brown skin. We speak the same language. How come my life was so different from theirs? How come I was the mother who was allowed to be present for the difficult but joyous privilege of raising my child? It felt like looking inequality in the face and coming to the realization that it looks just like me. But it was my Pulitzer Center grant on HIV that is right now the most poignant for me. That grant brought me to the drug dens in Cebu, Central Philippines, where we traced skyrocketing HIV infections to needle sharing. Now, I'm not sure about your own experience in a drug den, but mine was in a shoebox of a shanty, where users huddled in a corner to shoot up. It was cramped, it was hot, and it was stuffy. And hunched over, the users elbowed their way to the corner, apologetically saying, "Good evening po," which is a sign of respect in my language. "Excuse me, please. Passing through, please." I think it was easier for my co-grantee, VJ Villafranca, to take pictures once he promised them that no faces would be shown. But none of them wanted to talk to me. Can you imagine that? Yeah, of course. For a while, I was the only woman totally ignored in a room full of men. So I employed the most common and often most effective strategies known to journalists. I sat there and waited. Finally, 26-year-old Christian came up to me and said, "Ate," which is big sister, "I'll talk to you, but can I just shoot up first? Can you wait for me, or are you in a hurry?" Of course I waited. And when he was done, we had to quickly talk before the Nubain, which was his chosen downer, kicked in. After Christian, the others slowly came and began to talk to me. VJ and I spent most of late 2015 going to these drug dens. We were never met with hostility or animosity. One day after shooting, VJ and I laughed, shooting pictures, may I add. VJ and I laughed as we looked back at how polite and nice everyone was to us. Yesterday, October 7, marked the first 100 days since President Rodrigo Duterte assumed the presidency of my country and waged a war on drugs. Since then, almost 4,000 people have been killed in a mix of police operations and vigilante killings, most of them young, poor men like Christian. If I had given this speech 3 months ago, I would have had a different story to tell. One about a journalist who, through the Pulitzer Center, was given the incredible privilege of immersing herself in the unfolding narrative of her people and her country. An impoverished country that does not have much, but is never short on warmth and generosity. A country that was brought to its knees during Typhoon Haiyan, but honored its debt of gratitude to the countries that helped us the most by taking out thank you billboards in London, in Paris, in New York, and a handful of other locations. A country of 100 million people, some like Christian, who are not immune to human frailty, but also not immune to the human virtues of kindness and respect. Night has fallen on the Philippines. Expression of public outrage are muted by cyber lynch mobs who harass and threaten those who dare criticize the president. Journalists are discredited, labeled as being corrupt and biased. In the early days of his presidency, Duterte included journalists as among those who deserve to die. In many parts of the world, it also feels like night is falling. And it's during these times when journalists, together with organizations like the Pulitzer Center, must continue to speak truth to power, must barrel on to bear witness and continue to illuminate dark places with a deep sense of responsibility and interpret these troubled times. They say that optimism and hope are dangerous capricious for a journalist to have. I disagree. I'm going to echo some of the words I heard in today's panel and say it is precisely because we hope, precisely because we dare to question, because we want to outrage and inspire, that we go, with the help of the Pulitzer Center, to where the silence is. Thank you and good evening.